When I bought my new house, nestled in a quiet, tree-lined cul-de-sac, I thought I was finally stepping into a peaceful chapter of life. After years of renting cramped apartments and dealing with noisy neighbors, leaky faucets, and landlords who barely returned calls, the idea of having my own property felt like a dream come true. The house itself was a charming fixer-upper, nothing fancy but full of character, with a large backyard, a wraparound porch, and just enough odd quirks to make it interesting. It had been on the market for a while after the elderly owner passed away, and his children were eager to sell quickly, which worked in my favor. I closed at a great price and honestly didn't even hesitate when I saw that the home came with an HOA. I figured it was a formality, something meant to keep the neighborhood tidy and safe. The documents looked standard, the dues weren't outrageous, and everything seemed manageable. I had no clue that nestled in the heart of this peaceful neighborhood was a tyrant in pastel tracksuits, Marlene, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA. I met her within days of moving in, though it wasn't exactly a warm welcome. She showed up at my door unannounced, clipboard in hand and a little barking dog tucked under one arm, and proceeded to lecture me on recycling bins and uniformity expectations. I tried to smile and nod, chalking it up to small-town enthusiasm, but it didn't take long to realize this wasn't just a concerned neighbor, it was someone who thrived on control. Marlene had been president of the HOA for nearly a decade, and if neighborhood gossip was to be believed, she took her position more seriously than most people take federal government roles. She was the kind of person who measured the length of your grass with her eyes and could recite the HOA bylaws like scripture. It started small. A note left on my door about my mailbox being too modern in design. Then a second note, this one about a temporary wooden gate I had installed on the side of my yard for my dog. She claimed it violated visual aesthetic standards of the community, though I had read the HOA handbook front to back and found no such guideline. When I emailed her for clarification, I received no reply, just another note, then another. One day she showed up again in person, standing with arms folded as if I owed her rent, telling me the gate had to go. I tried to reason with her, even offered to paint or modify it, but she dismissed every suggestion. I realized quickly that this wasn't about rules, it was about power. Still, I tried to play nice. I submitted requests, asked for meeting minutes, and even attended the next HOA board meeting, where Marlene controlled the agenda so tightly that I barely got a word in. Meanwhile, the violations kept coming. My trash cans were out too long. My lawn was half an inch too tall. A Halloween decoration I hadn't even finished putting up yet was deemed too aggressive for children. It became clear that Marlene had made me her personal project. But then something strange happened. While reviewing the property lines to see if I could build a more compliant fence, I noticed a small, narrow strip of land that ran between my house and Marlene's. It wasn't part of either yard exactly, but it had a parcel number. Curious, I dug deeper. To my surprise, that odd little piece of land had actually transferred to me in the property sale. It had once belonged to Marlene and her late husband, but decades ago the previous owner of my home had purchased it from them, likely for garden space or storage. The sale was quiet, never updated in the neighborhood gossip mill, and apparently Marlene had completely forgotten about it. That side gate she kept complaining about? It wasn't even on her land. It was on mine. A piece of her original property was now legally part of mine. When I confirmed it with county records and title paperwork, I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and disbelief. I didn't rush to tell her. Instead, I waited for the next inevitable complaint, which arrived 2 days later in the form of another threatening note. This time I responded not with a letter, but with a printed copy of the land survey and the property deed, highlighting the parcel now in my name. I slid it under her door and waited. The reaction was everything I imagined it would be and more. The next morning I was sipping my coffee on the porch when I saw Marlene march out of her house in a fury, waving the printed documents like a white flag set on fire. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there at the edge of my driveway, flustered, as though she was still trying to comprehend the betrayal she thought I had personally orchestrated. I watched her expression shift through stages: denial, confusion, indignation, and then finally, a kind of offended disbelief. She marched over, Winston yapping furiously on his leash, and said, without so much as a greeting, "This must be a mistake." I replied calmly that it wasn't, that I had double-checked with the county, the title company, and the property records office. I offered her copies. She snatched the paper like it might burn her fingers and glanced at it again, muttering about legal tricks and technicalities. Then came the real kicker, she said, and I quote, "Even if the paperwork says it's yours, everyone here knows that land has always been mine." I blinked. Was this woman seriously trying to override legal ownership with neighborhood memory? I asked her as politely as I could manage if she had any documentation proving her claim. She didn't. All she had was her certainty, her conviction that she had some moral ownership because it's been in her family since 1984. I resisted the urge to laugh. I reminded her that in 1994, her husband sold that little parcel to the man who used to live in my house, and that the sale was legally recorded. She turned a shade redder, sputtering that she never would have approved it, as if her consent would have changed a decades-old transaction between two private parties. Then, almost as if realizing she was losing ground, she tried to pivot. Well, if you own it now, you should still follow HOA guidelines, she said sharply. That gate is not acceptable. I told her again. The gate was on private land, not common property, and the HOA had no jurisdiction over it. Her eyes narrowed, and I could almost hear the gears grinding in her head. This wasn't about the gate. It had never been about the gate. It was about control. About authority. About her having the last word. When she realized she couldn't bully me with HOA rules anymore, she tried to guilt-trip me instead, saying things like, "You know, this kind of behavior ruins the spirit of the neighborhood." I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing again. What ruined the spirit of the neighborhood was a self-appointed dictator measuring people's lawns with rulers and filing complaints over porch pumpkins. I stayed calm even as she stood on my driveway trying to redefine reality. I didn't raise my voice, didn't argue. I simply told her that the issue was settled, that the land was mine, and that unless she had new legal documents to offer, I considered the matter closed. She stood there for a few seconds more, clearly trying to decide whether to explode or retreat. She chose the latter, spinning on her heel with a dramatic, "Fine." Before storming off, Winston tripping over his own leash as they disappeared behind her white picket fence. But the drama wasn't over. Over the next week, I noticed a subtle but unmistakable shift. A few neighbors stopped waving. One or two crossed the street when I walked my dog. Someone left an anonymous note in my mailbox saying I was disturbing the peace and not being a team player. It didn't take a genius to figure out Marlene had been making her rounds, spinning her version of the story. I imagined her hunched over coffee with the retired couple down the street, telling them I was some kind of arrogant outsider trying to change everything. But not everyone was on her side. A neighbor named Joel, who lived 2 doors down, approached me one afternoon while I was raking leaves. He smirked and said, "So you're the guy who finally stood up to the queen?" I laughed and we ended up chatting for an hour. Turns out, Marlene had made enemies over the years. Joel told me about how she once fined someone for using the wrong kind of bird feeder, and how another neighbor moved away just to escape her micromanagement. I realized then that while she might control the HOA board, she didn't speak for everyone. And now that someone had challenged her, the cracks in her throne were starting to show. Still, she wasn't done yet. A week later, I received an official-looking envelope in the mail, from the HOA. Inside was a formal notice of review, requesting a compliance inspection of my backyard and structures. I couldn't believe it. She was doubling down. The next morning, I was sipping my coffee on the porch when I saw Marlene march out of her house in a fury, waving the printed documents like a white flag set on fire. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there at the edge of my driveway, flustered, as though she was still trying to comprehend the betrayal she thought I had personally orchestrated. I watched her expression shift through stages: denial, confusion, indignation, and then finally, a kind of offended disbelief. She marched over, Winston yapping furiously on his leash, and said, without so much as a greeting, "This must be a mistake." I replied calmly that it wasn't, that I had double-checked with the county, the title company, and the property records office. I offered her copies. She snatched the paper like it might burn her fingers and glanced at it again, muttering about legal tricks and technicalities. Then came the real kicker, she said, and I quote, "Even if the paperwork says it's yours, everyone here knows that land has always been mine." I blinked. Was this woman seriously trying to override legal ownership with neighborhood memory? I asked her as politely as I could manage if she had any documentation proving her claim. She didn't. All she had was her certainty, her conviction that she had some moral ownership because it's been in her family since 1984. I resisted the urge to laugh. I reminded her that in 1994, her husband sold that little parcel to the man who used to live in my house, and that the sale was legally recorded. She turned a shade redder, sputtering that she never would have approved it, as if her consent would have changed a decades-old transaction between two private parties. Then, almost as if realizing she was losing ground, she tried to pivot. Well, if you own it now, you should still follow HOA guidelines, she said sharply. That gate is not acceptable. I told her again. The gate was on private land, not common property, and the HOA had no jurisdiction over it. Her eyes narrowed, and I could almost hear the gears grinding in her head. This wasn't about the gate. It had never been about the gate. It was about control. About authority. About her having the last word. When she realized she couldn't bully me with HOA rules anymore, she tried to guilt-trip me instead, saying things like, "You know, this kind of behavior ruins the spirit of the neighborhood." I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing again. What ruined the spirit of the neighborhood was a self-appointed dictator measuring people's lawns with rulers and filing complaints over porch pumpkins. I stayed calm even as she stood on my driveway trying to redefine reality. I didn't raise my voice, didn't argue. I simply told her that the issue was settled, that the land was mine, and that unless she had new legal documents to offer, I considered the matter closed. She stood there for a few seconds more, clearly trying to decide whether to explode or retreat. She chose the latter, spinning on her heel with a dramatic "fine" before storming off, Winston tripping over his own leash as they disappeared behind her white picket fence. But the drama wasn't over. Over the next week, I noticed a subtle but unmistakable shift. A few neighbors stopped waving. One or two crossed the street when I walked my dog. Someone left an anonymous note in my mailbox saying I was disturbing the peace and not being a team player. It didn't take a genius to figure out Marlene had been making her rounds, spinning her version of the story. I imagined her hunched over coffee with the retired couple down the street, telling them I was some kind of arrogant outsider trying to change everything. But not everyone was on her side. A neighbor named Joel, who lived 2 doors down, approached me one afternoon while I was raking leaves. He smirked and said, "So you're the guy who finally stood up to the queen?" I laughed and we ended up chatting for an hour. Turns out, Marlene had made enemies over the years. Joel told me about how she once fined someone for using the wrong kind of bird feeder, and how another neighbor moved away just to escape her micromanagement. I realized then that while she might control the HOA board, she didn't speak for everyone. And now that someone had challenged her, the cracks in her throne were starting to show. Still, she wasn't done yet. A week later, I received an official-looking envelope in the mail, from the HOA. Inside was a formal notice of review, requesting a compliance inspection of my backyard and structures. I couldn't believe it. She was doubling down. The next morning, I was sipping my coffee on the porch when I saw Marlene march out of her house in a fury, waving the printed documents like a white flag set on fire. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there at the edge of my driveway, flustered, as though she was still trying to comprehend the betrayal she thought I had personally orchestrated. I watched her expression shift through stages: denial, confusion, indignation, and then finally, a kind of offended disbelief. She marched over, Winston yapping furiously on his leash, and said, without so much as a greeting, "This must be a mistake." I replied calmly that it wasn't, that I had double-checked with the county, the title company, and the property records office. I offered her copies. She snatched the paper like it might burn her fingers and glanced at it again, muttering about legal tricks and technicalities. Then came the real kicker, she said, and I quote, "Even if the paperwork says it's yours, everyone here knows that land has always been mine." I blinked. Was this woman seriously trying to override legal ownership with neighborhood memory? I asked her, as politely as I could manage, if she had any documentation proving her claim. She didn't. All she had was her certainty. Her conviction that she had some moral ownership because it's been in her family since 1984. I resisted the urge to laugh. I reminded her that in 1994, her husband sold that little parcel to the man who used to live in my house, and that the sale was legally recorded. She turned a shade redder, sputtering that she never would have approved it, as if her consent would have changed a decades-old transaction between two private parties. Then, almost as if realizing she was losing ground, she tried to pivot. "Well, if you own it now, you should still follow HOA guidelines," she said sharply. "That gate is not acceptable." I told her again. The gate was on private land, not common property, and the HOA had no jurisdiction over it. Her eyes narrowed, and I could almost hear the gears grinding in her head. This wasn't about the gate. It had never been about the gate. It was about control. About authority. About her having the last word. When she realized she couldn't bully me with HOA rules anymore, she tried to guilt-trip me instead, saying things like, "You know, this kind of behavior ruins the spirit of the neighborhood." I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing again. What ruined the spirit of the neighborhood was a self-appointed dictator measuring people's lawns with rulers and filing complaints over porch pumpkins. I stayed calm even as she stood on my driveway trying to redefine reality. I didn't raise my voice, didn't argue. I simply told her that the issue was settled, that the land was mine, and that unless she had new legal documents to offer, I considered the matter closed. She stood there for a few seconds more, clearly trying to decide whether to explode or retreat. She chose the latter, spinning on her heel with a dramatic "fine" before storming off, Winston tripping over his own leash as they disappeared behind her white picket fence. But the drama wasn't over. Over the next week, I noticed a subtle but unmistakable shift. A few neighbors stopped waving. One or two crossed the street when I walked my dog. Someone left an anonymous note in my mailbox saying I was disturbing the peace and not being a team player. It didn't take a genius to figure out Marlene had been making her rounds, spinning her version of the story. I imagined her hunched over coffee with the retired couple down the street, telling them I was some kind of arrogant outsider trying to change everything. But not everyone was on her side. A neighbor named Joel, who lived 2 doors down, approached me one afternoon while I was raking leaves. He smirked and said, "So you're the guy who finally stood up to the queen?" I laughed and we ended up chatting for an hour. Turns out, Marlene had made enemies over the years. Joel told me about how she once fined someone for using the wrong kind of bird feeder, and how another neighbor moved away just to escape her micromanagement. I realized then that while she might control the HOA board, she didn't speak for everyone. And now that someone had challenged her, the cracks in her throne were starting to show. Still, she wasn't done yet. A week later, I received an official-looking envelope in the mail, from the HOA. Inside was a formal notice of review, requesting a compliance inspection of my backyard and structures. I couldn't believe it. She was doubling down. When I opened the envelope and read the formal-sounding jargon requesting a compliance inspection, I nearly choked on my coffee. It was so transparent, so obviously a desperate attempt at retaliation, that I couldn't help but shake my head and laugh. According to the letter, a scheduled walkthrough of my property would be required to assess whether my improvements, including, of course, the infamous gate, met HOA standards. The kicker? The inspection would be conducted by none other than Marlene herself, as the acting HOA president and head of the compliance committee. I stared at the letter in disbelief. Was she really trying to set foot on my land, on her old land, to inspect something she no longer had jurisdiction over? It was absurd. It was petty. And it was a mistake. By this point, I had done enough research to know exactly where the HOA's power stopped. That parcel, now merged with my lot, was private property. And the HOA had no legal right to enter it or demand inspections without proper notice and written consent. I was more than ready for her now. I drafted a polite but firm response, citing the relevant sections from the HOA's own bylaws, as well as local property statutes. I let her know that she was not permitted to step onto my land without an appointment and written approval, which I was not inclined to give. I included a copy of the parcel deed again, just in case she had misplaced the first one. I sent it certified mail to the HOA's P.O. box and made sure it required a signature. That wasn't just for legal cover, it was also to annoy her. I imagined her face when she had to sign for a letter from me and opened it to find her own rules used against her. Days passed. No reply. Then one morning, I caught sight of her walking slowly past my house, eyes narrowed, clearly trying to see over the fence and into my yard without technically trespassing. She had a tape measure in one hand and was scribbling something on a clipboard. I gave her a friendly wave just to rub it in and she quickly turned and marched off. The next week, the inspection didn't happen. I figured she had given up until I got an email, not from her this time but from the HOA secretary, a timid man named Ron who always seemed slightly terrified of her. He said that after multiple neighbor complaints, the HOA would be re-evaluating compliance standards across the neighborhood, and that new guidelines would be discussed at the next board meeting. I almost applauded her creativity. Since she couldn't single me out, she decided to rewrite the rules. I RSVP'd to the meeting immediately. I knew it would be tense, but I wasn't about to let her build new walls around my yard just to satisfy her bruised ego. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a modest building that smelled faintly of stale coffee and carpet cleaner. About 20 people showed up, more than usual, which told me word had spread. Marlene opened the meeting with her usual flair, smiling like a politician and thanking everyone for coming. Then she launched into a dramatic monologue about preserving the visual harmony of the neighborhood and how recent changes were threatening the established character of the community. She never mentioned me by name, but everyone knew exactly what she meant. I waited until she finished her speech and then raised my hand. When she called on me reluctantly, I stood up and calmly asked a simple question. Can the HOA retroactively enforce new guidelines on existing private property, including land that has been legally deeded and is outside the original HOA easement? There was silence. She blinked. Someone in the back coughed. Ron shifted uncomfortably in his chair. I could see her brain working overtime, trying to formulate an answer that wouldn't make her look uninformed or worse, overreaching. She dodged, of course, saying that the board was still evaluating legal boundaries, and that special exceptions might be discussed. I pressed her again, politely but firmly, and reminded her that any new rules would need majority approval, and that enforcement on private, deeded land could open the HOA to liability. The moment I said liability, a few eyebrows in the room went up. I wasn't a lawyer, but I'd read enough online HOA horror stories to know what words made boards nervous. From that moment the mood shifted. A few neighbors spoke up, quietly at first, then more boldly, asking why so much time and attention was being spent on one gate, one property, when there were real issues to discuss, like security lighting and potholes in the shared roads. I almost smiled. For the first time, people were questioning her. The meeting ended with no vote, no inspection, and no new guidelines. Just a lot of awkward goodbyes and side glances. Marlene stormed out without speaking to anyone. And I went home, sat on my perfectly compliant porch and cracked open a cold beer. I had won the round, but I knew Marlene wasn't done yet. Over the next few weeks, the atmosphere in the neighborhood shifted in subtle but undeniable ways. Marlene, once the loudest voice on the block and the self-proclaimed enforcer of community perfection, had gone strangely quiet. Not silent, she still walked Winston past my house with theatrical disdain, but her presence no longer commanded the same fearful energy it once had. People started relaxing a bit. The neighbor across the street finally brought out his wind chimes again, which had mysteriously vanished last year after an anonymous nuisance noise complaint. Someone else repainted their mailbox bright yellow, something I'd heard Marlene had banned before because it clashed with the shrubbery. It was as if my pushback had shaken something loose in everyone else. For the first time, people started testing the waters of their own independence. That might sound poetic, but I wasn't naive. I knew Marlene wasn't finished. A person like her doesn't simply let go of power, she regroups. And regroup she did, quietly, strategically, and with just enough deniability to stay out of trouble. The first sign came when a lawn care company I'd scheduled canceled my appointment last minute. No reason given. Just a polite voicemail saying they couldn't service my address anymore. I called back and the receptionist sounded flustered before quickly hanging up. A few days later I heard from another neighbor, Joel, the guy who'd stood up for me at the meeting. His own landscaper had also received a warning from the HOA about unauthorized service providers. Apparently, Marlene had dusted off some obscure clause in the rules about only using approved vendors for external maintenance work, a clause nobody had enforced in years. It wasn't official, no board vote had been taken, but she was calling around, pretending to have the authority. That's when I realized her new tactic wasn't about rules, it was about isolation. She wanted to make it harder for me to maintain my home, harder to live comfortably, and easier to turn the tide of opinion against me. The more hassle I endured, the more likely I'd bend. Or leave. I wasn't about to do either. So I started keeping records. Every interaction, every phone call, every note I received from the HOA. Even the weird ones like when someone placed a pamphlet about respectful community engagement on my doormat. I made copies, took photos, documented everything. I wasn't just playing defense anymore, I was preparing for war. And then, out of nowhere, I got a call from the county zoning office. The woman on the line was polite but direct. She said a complaint had been filed about an unpermitted structure on my property. I already knew what this was about, the gate. Again. I explained that it wasn't a permanent structure, just a simple wooden gate installed with removable posts, and that it sat entirely on private land I legally owned. She seemed surprised. "Oh," she said, "well, the complaint states it's obstructing a shared drainage path and may be affecting runoff." I almost laughed. My property was on a slight slope, and there was no shared drainage anything nearby. But Marlene was getting creative. I offered to have an inspector come take a look. A week later the inspection happened and the man was in and out in 10 minutes. He even chuckled when he saw the gate, shook his head and said, "We get people like this filing complaints all the time." He left with no citations, and 2 days later I received written confirmation that no violations were found. I framed that letter and hung it in my laundry room. Petty? Absolutely. But I had earned it. Meanwhile, word was spreading. The failed complaint, the meetings, the sudden enforcement of obscure rules, it all began to paint a picture, and not one that flattered Marlene. The neighbors who had once kept their heads down were starting to talk. A few even stopped by to thank me for standing up to her. I learned that she tried to fine someone $50 for leaving a bicycle on their porch for longer than visually acceptable. Someone else told me she once called animal control on a family with a turtle pond. I had become a symbol of quiet resistance. And even if I hadn't asked for that role, I wasn't going to shrink away from it. Still, I knew Marlene. I knew this wouldn't end with a whimper. She hadn't yet played her final card. And based on the look she gave me the next time we crossed paths on the sidewalk, tight smile, eyes glinting with something unreadable, I knew she had something else planned. Something bigger. Maybe even illegal. But I was ready. At least I thought I was. I didn't have to wait long to find out what Marlene's next move was. About 10 days after the failed zoning complaint, I returned home from work to find a bright orange notice taped to my front door. For a second my heart sank. Another violation? Another bogus fine? But this time it wasn't from the HOA. It was from the city's Public Works Department. The notice claimed that a portion of my property, including the side yard where the gate stood, was now under investigation for possible encroachment onto city-owned right-of-way. I just stood there on my porch holding the paper, stunned. Encroachment? On what? That land had been transferred legally, surveyed, recorded, and taxed. I triple-checked every detail. This wasn't some mystery or technicality, this was a deliberate attack. And I knew exactly who was behind it. Marlene had reached beyond HOA drama. She had filed a report with the city. Somehow, she'd convinced someone in an office downtown that I was illegally occupying municipal land. That was serious. This wasn't like HOA fines you could ignore or argue over email. A city complaint could delay renovations, block construction permits, or even trigger court action. It was the kind of thing that could quietly destroy a homeowner's peace of mind, and Marlene knew that. What she didn't know was that I was already 10 steps ahead. I didn't wait for the city to call. The next morning I was down at the Public Works office with a folder full of documents. The title deed, the parcel map, the original land transfer from her late husband to the previous owner, and a full survey I'd had completed just 2 weeks prior. The clerk, a middle-aged woman named Angela, flipped through the papers, her eyebrows rising higher with each turn of the page. "Well, this clears it up," she said finally. "Looks like the complaint was based on outdated zoning data. Happens more than you'd think." I asked if the complainant's name was available. She smiled knowingly. "Let's just say we've had a few calls from your HOA president." Of course. I asked her what would happen next. She said the complaint would be marked resolved and closed out, and I'd receive a formal letter within 5 business days. No further action required. I thanked her and walked out feeling half relieved, half exhausted. I should have been happy, but all I felt was tired. How many more times was I going to have to prove that I was right, that I belonged here, that I wasn't the villain in someone else's fantasy of control? I got home, poured a drink, and sat on the back step by the gate, the same damn gate that had triggered months of insanity. I looked at it like it was some sort of cursed object, something simple and functional that had somehow become a symbol of defiance. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the lengths Marlene had gone to. The obsessive notes. The phony rules. The vendor blacklisting. The bogus complaints. What would she do next? Dig up an old building permit? Plant something in my yard and call the city again? I decided it was time to go on offense. The next day I contacted a lawyer. Not for a lawsuit, yet, but for documentation. I wanted an official cease and desist notice drawn up, citing harassment, slander, and potential defamation. I wanted to send it to the HOA board, the HOA's management company, if they even had one, and directly to Marlene. I didn't want to fight. But I wasn't going to be a passive character in her petty kingdom either. The lawyer agreed and told me something that made my day. She's walking a very fine legal line. If she continues to file complaints based on knowingly false claims, that crosses into actionable territory. I smiled at that. A few days later, I received the city's follow-up letter confirming that the complaint had been dismissed and that my land was clearly and legally defined. I laminated that one. But then came the next twist, one I never saw coming. I got a knock at the door. It wasn't Marlene. It was Ron, the timid HOA secretary. He looked like he hadn't slept in a week. He fidgeted, glanced over his shoulder, and then handed me an envelope. "I'm not supposed to give you this early," he said. "But, you should know. She's calling a special vote. She wants to change the HOA bylaws to allow for retroactive architectural violations." She's trying to write a rule that would make your gate illegal, after the fact. I opened the envelope. Inside was the draft agenda for an emergency HOA meeting, and sure enough, item number 2 read, Proposal to amend Section 3.1 to include retroactive authority over recent unapproved modifications. She wasn't just trying to control the present. She was trying to rewrite the past. Marlene was declaring war on reality, and I wasn't about to let her win. The special HOA meeting was scheduled for a Thursday evening, held in the community clubhouse again. Same beige carpet, same flickering overhead lights, same coffee-stained folding chairs. But this time the air felt different. Charge. I arrived early not because I was eager to face Marlene, but because I wanted a seat near the front, where she would have to look me in the eye when she presented her absurd proposal. To my surprise, nearly every seat in the room filled up within 20 minutes. People who had never shown up to previous meetings, people I didn't even know lived in the neighborhood, filed in with quiet curiosity, many holding copies of the meeting agenda. They knew what this was about. And they were here for it. When Marlene finally entered the room, clipboard in hand, pastel sweater tied around her shoulders like a cape, her smile was tight and brittle. She greeted a few of her loyal supporters, mostly older couples who nodded along to everything she said, but even they seemed quieter than usual. She cleared her throat and opened the meeting with her usual pleasantries, but the cracks in her polished tone were starting to show. Thank you all for coming tonight, she began. We'll be addressing some very important updates to our community standards, including new language that will help preserve the harmony and aesthetic of our beautiful neighborhood. I felt my jaw clench. Harmony. That word again. She used it like a weapon. Then she moved to item 2 on the agenda, the proposed bylaw change. Her voice sharpened as she explained it. Due to recent activity that has undermined the consistency of our neighborhood's appearance, the board is proposing an amendment to Section 3.1 of the Architectural Guidelines. This amendment will give the board authority to retroactively assess violations that were previously unregulated due to gaps or ambiguities in the current language. In other words, she was trying to rewrite the rules so she could punish me after the fact. It was unprecedented, manipulative, and borderline insane. But to someone unfamiliar with the situation, it almost sounded reasonable. I knew I had to speak, but I waited for her to finish her speech, waited for the murmurs to start. Then I stood, calmly. Quietly, but with intention. With all due respect, I said, addressing the room, I think we need to be very clear about what's happening here. This isn't about community harmony or architectural consistency. This is about one resident using her position to change the rules in the middle of the game, just to settle a personal grudge. A few people shifted uncomfortably. Marlene narrowed her eyes at me. That's a serious accusation, she said. I'm simply trying to protect the standards we've all agreed upon. I raised the folder I'd brought with me, copies of the city letters, the property deed, the complaint dismissals, the emails, even the laminated approval from the city inspector. Here's what I've done, I said, addressing the crowd now. Everything legally. Everything transparently. The land is mine. The gate is legal. The property is in compliance with city regulations. Marlene has filed false complaints, harassed service providers, and attempted to bypass the board's normal procedures to force changes that serve her personal agenda. I wasn't shouting. I didn't need to. The truth was heavy enough to land without volume. Then something incredible happened. A voice from the back of the room spoke up. He's not wrong. It was Joel, standing with his arms crossed. She did the same thing to my wife over our backyard trellis 2 years ago. Told us it blocked the community view. We had to tear it down even though it wasn't against any rule. Another woman spoke next. She fined us for having a solar panel that was invisible from the street. Said it ruined the aesthetic. A man near the coffee table added, she made my son take down his basketball hoop. Said it attracted the wrong kind of visitors. The room was buzzing now. Years of resentment were unraveling. Marlene's face had gone pale, her mouth a tight, twitching line. She tried to regain control, banging her clipboard lightly on the table. This is not relevant to the bylaw discussion, she snapped. But it was too late. Someone raised a motion to table the vote. Another seconded it. And then, unbelievably, someone else, Ron, the nervous secretary, suggested a review of Marlene's conduct be added to the next meeting's agenda. The vote on the bylaw amendment never happened. The meeting ended with half the room speaking in small, animated groups, while Marlene gathered her things in silence and left through the side door, avoiding everyone's eyes. That night I didn't celebrate. I didn't feel like I'd won anything. What I felt was relief. Not just for myself but for the entire neighborhood. Maybe this would finally be the beginning of the end of Marlene's reign. But even as I sat in the quiet of my living room, sipping a drink and watching the streetlights flicker, I couldn't shake the feeling that this story wasn't over yet. Because people like Marlene don't go down without one last swing. It was almost peaceful for a little while after that meeting. For the first time since moving in, I went an entire week without finding a passive-aggressive note in my mailbox or receiving some bogus violation from the HOA. The air felt lighter, neighbors were more relaxed, and even Winston, the little demon dog, seemed quieter, like he too had finally grown tired of barking at a war no one else wanted. I thought maybe Marlene had finally realized her time was up, that she'd overplayed her hand and lost her grip on the throne she'd guarded for a decade. I imagined her at home, fuming in silence, flipping through bylaws and calling her few remaining allies, desperately trying to find a way to reassert herself. But what I didn't imagine, what I couldn't imagine, was how far she would go to get revenge. It started with a knock on the door just after sunset on a Wednesday. I opened it to find two uniformed police officers standing on my porch. Not HOA volunteers, not city code enforcers, real officers. One of them introduced himself and said they had received a report of a property boundary dispute and potential trespassing issue. I blinked. A trespassing issue? I asked. On my own property? The younger officer glanced at a clipboard. According to the report, you've constructed a structure that partially lies on another resident's land and refused to remove it after being asked. I stood frozen for a second, stunned not by the accusation itself, this was just Marlene again obviously, but by the sheer gall of involving the police. Officer, I said, I have the deed. I have a survey. I have 3 official letters from the city confirming that this land is mine. I invited them in, pulled out the folder I now kept permanently in the hallway cabinet and laid everything out. They reviewed the documents carefully. The older officer gave a low whistle. This is solid, he said. Who filed the complaint? I asked, though I already knew the answer. The younger officer hesitated. We're not at liberty to say, but I think you know. Yeah, I knew. The officers apologized for the inconvenience and said they'd close the file. I thanked them and saw them out, but as I stood alone in the entryway afterward, my hands were shaking. Not from fear but from anger. This wasn't just pettiness anymore. This was escalation. False police reports? Harassment under the color of law? It was dangerous. And I knew right then that she wasn't trying to win anymore, she was trying to ruin me. The next morning I decided I'd had enough. I made a call to my lawyer and told him everything. I didn't want to play defense anymore. I wanted a restraining order. A real one. My lawyer agreed. With the documentation we had, including her complaint history, my neighbor's statements, and now the police call, it was enough to at least file a formal harassment complaint. But before the paperwork could even be submitted, things took an unexpected turn. That Friday Ron from the HOA stopped by again. This time he looked pale and panicked. I don't know how to say this, he said, but there's something you need to see. He handed me a manila envelope. Inside were copies of emails, leaked by someone on the HOA board. They were from Marlene. And they were damning. In one email, she explicitly instructed another board member to find a way to make the gate illegal even if we have to stretch the rules. In another, she encouraged filing anonymous complaints with the city to apply pressure. But the worst one, the one that made my blood go cold, was addressed to someone she called a contact at the precinct. In it, she suggested that a visit from law enforcement might remind him who this neighborhood belongs to. It was signed with her full name and HOA title. That was it. That was the line. She had abused her position, manipulated public resources, and weaponized the HOA to target me, personally and illegally. And now there was proof. Ron looked at me nervously. We didn't know she was doing this. She told us it was just about preserving the standards. But this is insane. I nodded, already dialing my lawyer again. It wasn't just about stopping her anymore. It was about accountability. It was about making sure no one ever pulled this kind of stunt again, not against me, not against anyone. As I stared down at the pile of printed emails, I knew one thing for sure. The next time Marlene heard from me, it wouldn't be at a community meeting. It would be through a court summons. Filing the lawsuit wasn't as dramatic as movies make it out to be. No slamming of papers on a desk, no angry shouting in a courtroom, just a quiet meeting at my lawyer's office, a few notarized forms, and a courier heading out the door with a manila envelope that might as well have had reckoning stamped on it. The legal action was straightforward. A civil harassment complaint, backed by documented evidence of false reports, defamation and abuse of power through the HOA. My lawyer also filed a formal cease and desist letter with the board, demanding Marlene's immediate recusal from any HOA matters related to my property. What I didn't expect, what truly blindsided me, was how fast everything moved after that. The moment the board received the documents, everything exploded. Ron called me 2 days later, his voice shaky but this time not from fear. He was furious. "She never told us about half of this," he said. "We're calling an emergency session. Not just a vote, this is removal." Apparently, the leaked emails had circulated. Someone had shared them with the entire board. Then someone else, probably Joel, had passed them to a few other residents. And then the floodgates opened. The quiet whispers of frustration that had been simmering for years boiled over into full-blown outrage. People were angry, really angry. Not just about me but about what Marlene had done to all of them. Her reign of passive-aggressive tyranny had left scars on nearly every homeowner in the neighborhood, and now, with proof in hand, they were ready to do something about it. The emergency HOA meeting was packed. Standing room only. Even the people who usually ignored the HOA entirely showed up, some with folded arms, some with clipboards, some with printouts of her emails. Marlene sat stiffly at the front, face blank, posture rigid, as if pretending none of it affected her. But I could see the crack in her armor. Her smile was gone. Her hands trembled slightly when she adjusted her reading glasses. She tried to defend herself, of course. Claimed the emails were taken out of context. That she was just doing her duty. That I was waging a personal vendetta. But no one was buying it anymore. One by one, people stood up and told their stories. Joel talked about the trellis she'd made them tear down. A young mother spoke about being fined $100 for having a plastic flamingo in her garden. An elderly man described being written up for not having enough neutral tones on his front porch furniture. Every story was another nail in her coffin. When it came time for the vote, it wasn't even close. Out of 28 eligible voting members, 25 voted for her immediate removal from the board. The other 3 abstained. Not a single vote in her favor. Ron stood up and read the formal motion, his voice steady and clear, and for the first time in what had probably been years, Marlene had no authority. She stood slowly, gathered her clipboard, and walked out without a word, Winston trailing behind her like a silent witness to her downfall. No one clapped. No one jeered. The silence was louder than any celebration could have been. But the fallout didn't stop there. A week after her removal, I received a letter from the HOA, this time an apology. A formal one. They admitted to failing to recognize the abuse of authority earlier. They rescinded all past fines related to my property, and they included a promise that going forward, all major changes or enforcement decisions would require majority board approval and documented justification. It wasn't just a victory for me, it was a policy change for everyone. Meanwhile, Marlene disappeared from public view. She stopped walking Winston around the block. Her once daily surveillance strolls ceased. I heard whispers that she'd put her house on the market, though I never confirmed it. A neighbor said she saw a for sale sign go up early one morning and vanish by afternoon. Maybe she changed her mind. Or maybe she realized she'd lost all control and couldn't bear to live in a neighborhood where she was no longer feared. I didn't see her again after that. And honestly, I didn't care to. The legal case was still open, pending mediation, but I didn't file for damages. I didn't want money. I just wanted peace. And for the first time since moving in, I had it. I could sit on my porch, drink coffee, and watch the wind move through the trees without wondering what absurd complaint would show up next. The gate? Still standing. Still legal. But now it had become more than a gate. It was a symbol of boundaries, of resistance, and of the moment the neighborhood took back its voice from one person who tried to rule it all. And as petty as it might sound, every time I walked through that gate I smiled. Months passed. The seasons shifted, and the neighborhood settled into a quiet rhythm that felt almost unfamiliar after so much drama. The meetings continued, but now they were shorter, less tense, and, for the first time, actually productive. The board restructured itself, Ron stepped in as interim president, and the new members included people who actually seemed to care about the community rather than controlling it. Gardens bloomed freely without fear of aesthetic violations. Kids rode their bikes without being chased down for noise disturbances, and the air of silent judgment that used to hang over every yard sale and driveway conversation disappeared. It was like the entire neighborhood took a deep breath and finally exhaled. As for me, I got back to living. No more folders of complaint letters, no more printing legal documents like I was preparing for trial. I finally put furniture on my porch, hosted a few backyard cookouts, and started getting to know people I'd previously only waved at from a distance. Turns out, a lot of us had more in common than we thought. We just needed one shared enemy to realize it. That, ironically, might have been Marlene's only real contribution to the neighborhood, uniting us through mutual frustration. I hadn't seen her since the vote. A few neighbors swore they caught glimpses, curtains twitching from her front window, the occasional shadow slipping out to collect mail at odd hours, but she was practically a ghost now. Her name was barely mentioned anymore, except as a cautionary tale. Don't go full Marlene, someone would joke if a conversation at a meeting got too heated. And everyone would laugh, even Ron. But deep down, I wondered what had really become of her. Did she regret anything? Did she see herself as the villain in this story, or was she still convinced she was the misunderstood hero, ousted by a rebellious mob? One early morning, months after the lawsuit had been dismissed by mutual agreement, no damages, no further contact, I took a walk around the block. It was the first crisp fall morning of the year, the kind that makes everything smell like wood smoke and dried leaves. I passed her house, out of nothing but habit. The blinds were open for once, and to my surprise she was there, sitting on the sofa, staring at the TV, her face pale and sunken, Winston curled up beside her. She didn't see me, or maybe she did and just didn't care. For a moment I felt, not pity exactly, but something adjacent to it. Marlene hadn't just lost a position or some power, she'd lost her identity. Her entire self-worth had been wrapped up in controlling this little neighborhood, and once that was gone, what was left? An empty house, a fading reputation, and a dog too old to bark at anything anymore. I kept walking. I wasn't interested in revenge or redemption. The story was over. But later that same day, something strange happened. A for sale sign appeared in her yard, not the discreet kind from a local agent, but a huge, garish one from one of those national chains that screamed, "Move in ready," and "Price to sell." And just like that, whispers started up again. Did she finally give up? Did the board push her out? Is someone actually going to buy that place? It sold in 2 weeks. Cash buyer. No contingencies. People said it was an investor. Someone with big plans to renovate. Others said it was a family relocating from out of state, completely unaware of the saga that had unfolded behind those beige walls. Either way, by the end of the month, Marlene was gone. No goodbye, no boxes out on the curb, no U-Haul. Just gone. And you know what? That was enough. Her exit didn't need fanfare. It was quieter than her rule ever was, and far more fitting. In the weeks that followed, life moved on. I planted a few trees on the strip of land she once tried to claim. I put in a stone bench next to my gate, the one that started it all. Sometimes I sat there in the evening, sipping coffee or just watching the sun set behind the rooftops. It was peaceful. Simple. Everything I'd wanted when I first bought the house. And every now and then, a neighbor would walk by and smile. Sometimes they'd stop to sit and chat. No complaints. No citations. Just people being neighbors. One evening, Ron stopped by and sat with me for a few minutes. We didn't talk about her. There was no need. But as he stood to leave, he looked back at the gate and smiled. "You know," he said, "it's kind of poetic, isn't it?" I raised an eyebrow. "What is?" He nodded toward the property line. "You bought the land she obsessed over for years. All that noise. And in the end, it was never hers to begin with." I chuckled. Poetic might be the nicest way to put it. He laughed, tipped an imaginary hat, and walked off down the street. And I sat there, watching the gate swing gently in the breeze, knowing that in the end, I hadn't just won an argument. I'd reclaimed something bigger, my space, my peace, and the right to enjoy them without fear. And that, more than anything, was the real victory.